Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session about Shana Rishona, building healthy intimacy. Apologize for the slight delay in timing. It's really sorry about that. Sorry about the slight delay in timing. We are currently experiencing as a whole community a difficult beginning to this conference and a rocky start to this week. It's really such a difficult time that we're having as a people, and I think that coming together like this in this conference, where thank God we have thousands and thousands of people coming from all around the world, even right now participating in this specific class, we have over 300 people, and in every one of the classes that are going out through the week, we're coming together to build a stronger community. And we know that the building blocks of building such a strong community has to be building up the family. And it's not remiss to notice that all of Torah starts with this theme. Breshit and Noach starts off by telling us how the world can possibly go wrong. What can happen, how God creates such a beautiful world, Vayar Elohim ki tov me'od, and then all of a sudden everything breaks down only within a few generations. We go from Adam to Cain and Hevel to the Dor Enosh to Noach, and everything seems to be falling apart. And then we need to rebuild. But the rebuilding of the world does not start. The building of the world does not start with some gigantic movement. It doesn't start with an amazing speaker who's coming out and explaining to us, but rather it starts with a family. And this family is what creates everything from onwards. The family of Avram and Sarah, who build a strong relationship, Yitzchak and Rivka, Yaakov and his children, and that family we know is the root. And I think the reason why is to show us that the building blocks of any great movement, of any idea, of any belief system, has to be through the family. So we're here to strengthen the family. The first class that we have today is about Shana Rishona. And the first year of marriage always is fraught with many different issues and many different obstacles, from transitioning over from a life where you're pretty much on your own to a life which you're building with somebody else. And very often, in order to create that strong foundation, what's needed is really the ability to figure out how to not only as a couple strengthen that beginning, but we're going to be speaking about how as a community we can strengthen young couples, and how these young couples can notice some of the issues that may be forming and how to deal with them early on. Now, what's really important is to realize that the truth is it's never too early to be in Shana Rishona. Bezrat Hashem, every year we should feel like we're in Shana Rishona. And I hope that whoever's in the crowd, whether or not you've been married for 1 year, 2 years, or planning to get married soon, or been married for 25 years, we can learn how to build building blocks. It's never too late to build those blocks. So I'd like to introduce Yoetzet Shiffy Friedman, who's joining us today in order for us to learn together how we can build a stronger relationship with our spouses, and that relationship is what creates the greatest movement ever in human history. So I just want to start off by asking Shiffy a question. Now, it's a question that's quite relevant to us, because I think that while every year Shana Rishona is something that is fraught with obstacles, things you got to figure out. But definitely this year, anybody who started their marriage this year it's always with so much more of a challenge because they're always together in lockdowns, dealing with things that even people who've been married for many, many years have a structured house and know how things run. Everything is turned over. And I want to ask, what normal issues do you find that you have to be cognizant about during Shana Rishona? And in your work as a Yoetzet Halacha, as well as a Kala teacher, what advice would you be giving to somebody who would be getting married at this stage during such a turbulent time?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. I think I'll just take a step back, if that's okay, Rabbi Mazer, and just mention a few other. Say it again.
Go for it. The floor is yours.
Okay, I'm just hearing myself for the first time, and I thought there was maybe an echo, but we'll just go with it. It's really wonderful to be here. I feel strongly, as I said, that it's a difficult transition to make into the conference. We know that we're here as a community, and we're here to talk about building community, and specifically here we're talking about shalom, about peace in the home. But that idea really resonates right now. I think we're all searching for that deep peace in such a turbulent time. But we are here to try and make that transition, because the topic that we're here to discuss is really important. And I don't know how much it's really been on our mind as a community this past year. There have been so many people in need of our support. Everybody's needed support in some way, and I'm not so sure that we really had a chance, as far as I've seen at least, to talk about couples who are in their first year of marriage. So I think this is a special opportunity. I have the privilege of working with Kalod and working with couples. I kind of see people throughout a span of a few years, both as a high school teacher and working with students on college campus, and then we're working with women in answering their Yoetzet Halacha questions. So sometimes it's just a short conversation where you have a window into someone's life. They're having a hard time practicing nida. But it's in this bigger context of, I just got married 3 months ago, and there's a pandemic going on. And Shana Rishona is hard to start. So it is, there definitely are times when we see the confluence of those factors and those challenges. And sometimes I see it as part of a broader picture if, I'm really sitting down with someone for a few hours in Kala classes. So I think it's even before we get to Shana Rishona, we'll speak today, hopefully, also about some of the challenges in getting married during COVID, and then transitioning into a Shana Rishona during COVID. So your question specifically now, I know, was about some of the challenges in Shana Rishona, specifically during COVID. So I think, anytime you're looking to merge two people, you're coming from such different places and often coming with different expectations. And sometimes that can be manifested in bigger types of decisions. And sometimes that's just in the everyday types of things that seem so natural to us, such as who takes care of different household responsibilities. And you're coming from two different homes, so you've seen different models for that. And something that might seem so natural to you, of course that's the role of a wife in a family, or of course that's the role of a husband in a family. All of a sudden you enter and you're both coming with these different expectations, and how do you know that you don't even always realize that the other person has those different expectations? That's something that I like to always mention during college classes. It's not something that you would even necessarily think to talk about, but I'll give a list here. These are some things you could just ask. Who manages the finances in your home, and what types of discussions happen in your home? What are the different roles of the different families? So I remember that was something personally coming into my marriage, and my family looked one way and then my husband's family looked another way. So we said, oh, okay, so that's not automatically you're going to be your responsibility. Okay, so what's that going to look like? And I think in a pandemic, when we all were building out this new routine, right? Many of us were home all the time. And now, if you had a certain expectation over who does the cooking in the household, well, then you're hitting that that point of potential conflict 3 times a day instead of just, maybe once a day or however much you'd be home. So that could definitely be challenging for new couples, being home a lot more and having potential opportunities for conflict. Of course, there could also be potential opportunity for coming together, but there were a lot more opportunities to work on those different areas.
Right. So, I mean, what you're saying is that generally what the advice that you would give to a couple that's getting married and how they can best build their building blocks is to set expectations, is to communicate those expectations, is to be able to understand each other and know that nobody can read your mind and nobody knows, and in order for us to start off with the right foot, it's needed for us to kind of set those expectations and speak about the issues that will come up, because nothing is a given. However,
Sure.
you mentioned, however, what you've described is that in a pandemic, that's not even possible, and that's what makes it even more difficult. And I think that the truth is not just during a pandemic. Things change very, very quickly, and I think that in a certain sense, this couples that just got married this year got a sense of real life. All of a sudden, the job changes. All of a sudden, a kid is diagnosed with a specific illness, and everything in life changes. So, how would you suggest that couples kind of create that line of communication to be able to not only set expectations, but know how to work together when those expectations are blown out of the water?
Right. It can be so challenging for a couple who doesn't have that bank of experiences to really draw upon. There was a time when we as a couple had a challenge and this is how we dealt with it. Maybe even we got help to deal with that challenge at that time. And we're going to use those same skills to get through this together. But I think setting time to communicate about those things can be really helpful. Instead of meeting, at a busy point of the day when I don't know, you're preparing dinner together and you start talking about some of the challenges going, well, is that a good time for your spouse to talk? Sit down and say, these are some things that we want to work through. When's a good time for you to talk? And then both partners can come to the conversation open for conversation, ready to listen to the other person and not just sort of being caught off guard. Sometimes we like to even prepare for those conversations and think about what are the points I want to make, what are the things I want to say, and what are the things that I'm also willing to give up on. Because compromise is going to be so important. We mentioned before coming in with certain expectations, and sometimes we're going to need a budge, and sometimes those expectations aren't even so important. They're just what we're used to. But if we stop and think about, I think actually I really could be open to doing something your way, having that openness can be really important for finding a compromise. And compromise doesn't need to be meeting in the middle. It doesn't need to be 50-50. Maybe sometimes it'll look more like what I'm aiming for and sometimes more what you're aiming for. But if we come at it with an open mind and looking towards the other person, trying to understand their perspective, I think we have a shot at that. I think often people expect that they're going to really be in sync on everything with their spouse. Like you're going to feel as one person, which is a beautiful thing, we're aiming towards, but you're different people, you have different experiences, and we're always aiming to sort of like cross that gulf and as much as possible build intimacy and communication to feel as much as you can what their feelings are, what their thoughts are, what their perspectives are. But sometimes recognizing that there's also a gap. We are two different people. We're in two different bodies, in two different minds, two different hearts. Sometimes I think that can be helpful too. The other person's going to have needs that you're going to try to meet. You're a natural person who also wants to meet his or her own needs, and keeping that in mind can be helpful as well.
So I think, just to say it in a little bit more of a blunt way, maybe it's just the Israeli side rubbing off, but when people come in, what you're saying is that when people come into marriages, there's a kind of this in the back of their minds, there's a what's supposed to be, not just vis-a-vis how we work out the house, but there's this expectation of this bond that we're going to have. And we always learn about the bond of marriage and the love and the romance and even Vayivna Basar Echad, and it's all wonderful and it's all great. And we have to just put down and kind of we have to write it in the sand, and we have to put the line on the ground and say, listen, you are not the same. You're not going to be on the same mindset on every issue, and maybe even very few issues. And therefore, this ideal or this vision of marriage that you kind of are looking towards is not something that exists, but rather it's something that you create. And we have to be intentional, very intentional about the way that we communicate, about the way that we work together. It can't just come. And I think that the truth is that's kind of the mindset of this whole get-together that we're having as a community, which is we have to be intentional about family. We have to be intentional about our relationships. We can't expect them to grow on their own. And I think that one of the most important things, and I know that, meaning just for me, and I'm married for many more than 1 year, and I think that this year we've had so many different changes. Every 6 weeks has been a change, but and there was always frustrations after every change for about 2-3 weeks until we realized, wait a second, we have to stop and think about this. And until we kind of created an intentional time within every day that we would discuss what's going on, then everything falls apart. And you have to be intentional, meaning we're not in sync even after many, many years of marriage. And so kol shekain, couples right at the beginning, I think that there has to be, the truth has to be told. We have to pull the curtain off the facade. There is no such thing as being in sync. You have to be intentional, and you have to be able to create, to make a share, to bridge those gaps and be open to that fact.
No one's a mind reader.
All right, there's no mind readers, exactly. I want to take things in a little bit of a different direction. And I think one of the biggest transitions, especially within our community, is not only just the transition from living on your own and being an independent person, which we described, into becoming a couple, which has its own issues, but I think that's especially within our community, where sexuality is seen and intimacy is seen all throughout your young adult life or in your teenage life, is seen as something that should be shunned, should be pushed away, and you should be careful of. And it's fraught with a lot of guilt. And therefore, there's moving over from the transition, meaning I think the transition from dating to engagement to marriage is big enough, but it's gradual. The transition on the intimacy side between completely forbidden one from the other, completely usher, and sometimes not even having healthy conversations about intimacy ever in your life, to just move quickly, just jump over that hurdle and enter into a world of what's supposed to be Shechina Shara B'neihem. The Gemara says that when a husband and wife come together, the Shechina is with them. And it's like the Beis HaMikdash. And so how do you make that transition? How would you, in a certain sense, be madrich couples? And I'll add on top of that, we'll do one at a time, but how could maybe parents or our community better prepare people for that charismatic jump from the world of everything physical is usher to it's a mitzvah and it's the most wonderful thing and it brings the Shekhinah into your home?
There were a lot of parts, so you'll have to remind me if I forget one of them. But I think in my role as a Yoetzet, and I also teach mikveh and mikveh and sexuality class in senior year of high school, and sometimes I teach it on campus. So from where I'm coming from, in some ways, I feel I talk about this a lot more than healthy relationships and Shana Rishona. But I think that's actually an element of, it depends which community you're in. Even the phrase Shana Rishona, I don't really see people using that phrase. I don't really hear people using the phrase Shalom Bayit. We talk about healthy communication. Maybe there's something to work on there. Maybe we need to talk more about it. And I think we do. And that's why we're here. But in some way, but I'm sure that there are places where the balance is still a lot about talking about healthy communication and how to get used to living with another person, and still not enough on the sexuality piece. But I just want to mention that in some places, I think we are really beginning to have a lot of those conversations. And of course, both of these elements of transitioning into marriage are important. You mentioned the parent piece and you mentioned the community piece. So I think you're right that it's really the responsibility of both the parents and the schools and the community, which I guess in this case is best defined as the schools, to start talking about intimacy at a young age. And there are a lot of great resources out there. And actually, it looks like there's an amazing session leader today at this conference, which I know I'm going to try to make time to go to, about teaching your children about intimacy, because setting yourself up for having those conversations is so important. You can't just go into it. It doesn't come naturally. So a lot of parents like to plan those out, and it's not just one conversation, but it's a whole approach that you take to talking about intimacy and about our bodies. And I don't know that we'll get so much into that, but I think for people who are at that stage of young parenting, parenting young children, that's something that's really important to think about. And from a community, a teacher, an education perspective, we do need to be open in our conversations about sexuality and not treat it as something so taboo. Of course, it's so complicated because sometimes you present the information in an open way, and then students are so confused. But you're also teaching about Shomer Negia one day, and then about sexuality the next day, and I don't think that we have a good answer to that. Yes, there's a conflict, but we don't want. We still feel that these are both important areas. You need to understand your body. You need to understand. Not just what to expect in the future, but what's going on inside of you at this moment. And then there are students who are in maybe sexually active relationships, or maybe just they're not shomer negia. I mean, that's a reality in many communities, and we can't close our eyes to that and not have those conversations about being healthy in that within that reality. So I think that's an important aspect also. And if we just start having conversations about healthy intimacy in kala classes, whether it's the first class or many people leave it to the last class, and that might be a week before the wedding, and then it's a lot of information. Kala classes in general, it's a lot of information, learning how to keep Hilchot Nida if you haven't learned that at an earlier point. So a lot of schools do give at least some basics about Hilchot Nida, whether in senior year of high school or maybe in a year in Israel, you learn types of halachot, and that could be really important in knowing, an important foundation of Jewish family life that's often not talked about, and you don't see people in these laws. You don't eat at someone's Shabbos table and learn Hilchot Nida like you'll learn the halachot of how to do kiddush and lecha mishnah, right? These things they're not in view for everyone to see. So we do need to talk about them and not leave it for the last minute, for sure. And the final point that I'll add is, I think, redefining what kedusha is in a marriage, in a sexual relationship specifically, because it's true, we say this idea of like shchina shriya beinehem. The Gemara teaches it's this beautiful thing. The couple has this holiness in their intimacy. But I think what the holiness is about is bonding with another person and seeing the other person's needs and having that relationship only with them, right? Kedusha means to be separate. You're separating yourself from everyone else. You're dedicating yourself to this person. So once you take away some of that lofty talk, what is Kedusha in a marriage about? It's about these healthy relationship building blocks that hopefully we're talking about and inculcating in all sorts of ways in the process of growing up. Maybe not even in this whole need mikveh context, but I know this is not my particular role as a high school teacher, but the guidance counselors do an amazing job talking about healthy relationships and they bring in outside speakers to talk about what are some red flags. That's an important discussion. Also another topic on this conference. And and what are the healthy building blocks, right? We don't always have to talk about the bad behaviors. In addition to that, I mean, we have to, but in addition to that, we have to say, but what does it look like? What are the important aspects of building a healthy relationship? So I think all of that really becomes a foundation for the kedusha that you have in a marriage. And those healthy relationship building blocks are not just in dating relationships, but also in friendships and in parent-child relationships and sibling relationships. Learning how to listen and to be an empathetic individual, right? We can apply that to our friends, to so many different things, and not just to marriage.
Right. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I just want to, maybe if I would summarize what you're saying in just a few words. I think that what you've described is the need for intentionality of these types of topics within our community. And that building a healthy relationship, because of all the different areas that we've described, in terms of communication, in terms of being open to other people, in terms of living with outside of yourself, in terms of setting expectations, in terms of intimacy, in terms of creating an intimacy that is diametrically different to possibly what could have existed before, but rather within the confines of a deep commitment, in the confines of being mikadesh somebody, meaning that they are the sole person that you're connected to. That needs a tremendous amount of work, and it's not something that comes from that. So as a community, I think that you're correct. These types of things have to be worked on, meaning we have to encourage chassan and kala classes to be longer and more structured in a certain sense. Meaning very often, unfortunately, I teach chatanim, and very often, at least within the yeshiva world, it's, I think, more possibly than in some other communities, because when you're in yeshiva and you're learning, you have that focus on learning and preparing yourself. But even there, it's very informal. It's very, 6 weeks before marriage, you do once a week, 6 classes. And this is something that takes a long time, meaning boys prepare for their bar mitzvah for a year. And so, kol shekain, your bar mitzvah, okay, that prepares you for the life of mitzvot, but to create a marriage, which is such a large step, it needs focus, it needs time, and it needs intentionality, and it needs people to be doing that. It needs community support. We need the community to come together to talk about these issues. The other area that you spoke about in terms of creating that correct intimacy, would you be able to give us a little bit of a sense of how to create communication within intimacy? Meaning, we spoke about how the intimacy should be a reflection of, or an expression of, a relationship that is built upon the proper communication. Would it be possible for you to give us a little bit of a sense of how to create that? How do you build a proper communication about intimacy? And I think that for many people coming out of a frum lifestyle, it's even weird to say certain things out loud, to ask, is this something that is something that's good for you? Is that something that is that just speaking about intimacy? And maybe Rachel, who's joining us, to give a little bit more of an insight on how to create proper communication within intimacy itself.
It looks like I'm walking in for a good question. I first just want to apologize to everyone. I put down the wrong time. I was very proud of myself. I was super organized arranging childcare, and I guess these things happen. This used to be a nightmare of mine, that I was going to oversleep for a presentation and not be in the right place at the right time. So it's happened. So I'm a little frazzled, but I'm good. So the question is how do couples...
So I'll give you the background. All right, let's take a step back. And I think that it's always good. These are really important topics to kind of structure things out. So we spoke about, number one, the need to set expectations. But on the other hand, the biggest expectation that we have to set is the fact that within every marriage, you cannot have expectations that we're on the same wavelength at all time, and that we're two different people, and we have to be open to each other and understanding of each other, and the fact that we can never read anybody's mind, and we have to be intentional about that. Then we spoke a little bit more about the transition from a life where where intimacy is seen as something which is negative and usher and forbidden, to a life which is full of which is a pinnacle of a relationship, and it's something that you build, and it's something that Shekhinah Torah b'neihem, and it's something that's beautiful and seen in a good life, and that transition. And now we transition to put those two topics together in order to try and figure out how the communication side and the openness and how we talk to each other, how we build those communication skills actually are able to help build that healthy intimacy. And now we want to know how that's done. And so thank you for joining us in order for us to learn.
So a couple of things, and I think it's great that you brought up expectations, because expectations really set a foundation for what I find for many people to be their capacity to feel satisfied in a relationship is very dependent on what their expectations are. So contentment is very difficult to attain when you have expectations. I think the first step is for people to articulate for themselves, figure out for themselves the expectations that they're bringing into their marriage. I think a lot of people don't necessarily spend the time to reflect on, well, what is my concept of marriage? What is my concept of sexuality? What is my concept of intimacy? What do I think is supposed to happen when two people who are coming from different backgrounds, who may have a lot in common, but at the end of the day are two separate individuals? So I think number one, what's important for people to think about is there's aspects of being married that you learn on the job, but then there's also the prep aspect. And there are some couples that get married and really did not necessarily have a very clear understanding of sexuality, or it was taught with more euphemisms and it wasn't very clear. And I find that mishum tznius, from a modesty perspective, I understand why there's a hesitation sometimes to talk about sex very specifically, but it's important for people to understand clinical terms, to understand the way their bodies work. Because if you want to create healthy sex and create pleasurable sex, you have to be able to know what you're each talking about. And when you can't use clinical terms, or you can't articulate to each other what isn't happening for you, then that will add a lot of issues and keep things very, very stuck. So the first thing is for people to have an understanding of, what are my expectations about sex? What ideas have I picked up about sex from media, from movies, from books, from informal education, from formal education? Because I find sometimes people will learn things here and there, and those things can kind of stay stuck for them. And until it's corrected, it still kind of haunts them on a certain level. I think also it's important for people to realize that it takes time for two people to be able to figure out together how to have a pleasurable experience. And the idea that you're going to get married and right away it's going to just click perfectly. You know, I often say when you buy a new pair of shoes, they look the best when you first buy them, but that's not when they're the most comfortable, right? So that's kind of the way I see it, is understanding your bodies, each person understanding their own body well, being able to learn together how to articulate to each other what feels good, and also understanding when is a good time to have conversations about pleasure, when is not such a great time. I often say to couples, it's not a great time to be talking about, you know, pleasure and what is and isn't working if you're both laying in bed naked. It's a very vulnerable time for people to be getting feedback that could feel where they might feel very, very defensive. So it's important for people to also think about the time and place that they're having these types of discussions with their partner.
So I think this goes back to a theme that we've been hearing a lot from Shiffy and as well as Rachel, that there needs to be a set time for these types of conversations. And these conversations cannot just happen. And I think that everything about what we're describing in Shana Rishona, it's like anything in Torah and anything in mitzvos, and truthfully anything in life, which is, if you don't make it happen intentionally with communication, with talking about it, and not just in the moment. It's very easy to deal with things in the moment. I know that, meaning that's like when you shine, like that's when you have to, but that's not necessarily that doesn't really get the job done. And so what you're describing as creating that right communication outside of the actual bedroom itself is fundamental to building that proper relationship. Just another question, and I think in the next 10 minutes, as we wind down to the end of the class, I'd like to open it up. Everyone can write questions within the question and answer area of the chat, and we have a few questions already, and I'd like to just start with one.
Rabbi Mazer, can I first add on to a piece that you just said about the communication piece?
Absolutely, go for it.
So I think it's a really important point, because if a couple is not able to have healthy and safe communication outside of their sexual functioning, then it's going to be even more difficult to have open communication around sexual functioning. I find there are many couples that are actually have very good communication in general, but it's very difficult to talk about sex for a variety of reasons. People struggle talking about sex. So it's important for people to kind of have that sense of safety. And when you talk about couples being able to communicate, I find that right now something we're dealing with, not just in the pandemic, but in general, is people being very, very distracted. And so when you want to have a conversation with your partner, it doesn't necessarily feel like you could just turn to them and talk to them. You feel like they're probably looking down at their phone. And so you're almost like asking them a favor, like, hey, can you take a break from whatever you're reading or watching so I can talk to you about something? Which then already just makes it more difficult. The 3 A's that I find helpful for people to reflect on within themselves and their relationship is attention, affection, and affirmation. These are things that are very strong when people are dating, and they come very naturally. So attention, meaning giving people your attention, making eye contact. Affection it could be physically affectionate, but doesn't have to be. It could be verbally affectionate also. And then affirmation, and affirmation is not the same thing as saying thank you, right? It's the difference between saying thank you for dinner versus looking at your spouse and saying, you're a really good cook. This was awesome, right? It sounds differently. It feels differently. And I found when people are dating, those things flow very easily, right? People will say to each other, oh my God, you're so funny. Like, it's so fun hanging out with you, right? When people get married, I find those things start to fall by the wayside a little bit. And these are things that you can have in your marriage every single day. Taras and Shaffa, whether you're in Nida or not, you can have intimacy every single day of your marriage. You just may not always be allowed to have sex every day, but you can always have that sense of intimacy and that communication. When the communication around sex is able to have a cushion of healthy communication in general, you have so much more of a chance for things to become better and more connected and more pleasurable.
Okay. Those are some.
I see that you mentioned also Torah.
Yeah,
Rabbi Mazer, did you want us to address the question of Torah mishpat during COVID specifically, or should we go to a different question with a Halacha specifically during?
So I think that people have found an extra difficulty, especially in Shana Rishona. Halachos are very, very are a big deal. I just remember the transition from mutter to asur to mutter to asur to mutter to asur was like such a ping pong, and it was really, really hard to kind of make those transitions. I think after time, it's something that people get used to, and it gets a lot better. But I would imagine if having to go through that ping pong when you're home all day, when when you're just dealing with, just like you're never outside, you're just constantly together. I can sense that those are much, much more difficult. Is there any tips that you have to how people in general, I guess, even outside of the pandemic, but how people can work within the confines of halacha and really build a strong marriage without so much frustration with the transitioning?
Okay.
Or Rachel, yeah.
Can I start with that? Sure. Yeah, I think that what you said is so true. There's so challenging about how to keep
I don't know if it's just me. I'm hearing an echo. Maybe it's just me.
Go for it.
Let me try again. Maybe we should mute when we're not talking. But it's certainly challenging to learn how to keep the harchakot And when you don't have as many other distractions, but you're so focused in your first year of marriage on your marriage in such a wonderful way, right? A couple is learning how to build that healthy communication, and then you're told that it's different 2 weeks out of the month, or have maybe as many other distractions at a later point in their marriage. The couple might have children, and then they're just not focusing on each other in the same way, which maybe that comes with its own set of challenges. But for a couple, it might be easier at that point. A couple who's really just thinking about each other, all the time, and they're in your face all the time. What do you do? I think that some things that Rachel mentioned just a moment ago can be helpful in terms of like looking at the other person and saying something kind. You might have to be intentional about that. I know that's been something that's come up again and again, be intentional in our communication. You might have to think, what's something that I could do for them tonight to show my love, to show that I'm thinking about them, even though they're just in the next room, maybe working on their computer and I'm in this room working on mine, or maybe we're really in each other's space, a little more than we want to be. What's something I could do to be a little extra kind, to do something for them? Those also, when you're in different spaces and you're in need, that could be a nice thing to do. And thinking also about activities that you could do together. For some couples, it might look a little bit like dating again, but there might be fewer things that you could do together. Maybe you miss touch, and that's a natural part of your night together when you're winding down. But instead to say, is there a game that we like to play together? What's something that we want to learn how to do together? Is there something we could experience together that doesn't involve that touch aspect? Some couples find that helpful. It's a very couple specific kind of thing, so it's hard to give ideas. I think each couple has to think what works for themselves. I also see a lot of people who, if they're taking birth control, they extend their cycle so that they don't become needless so often. Not everybody has the flexibility to do that. Not everybody's bodies will work like that, but some people do find that to be helpful in dealing with needs at the beginning. And I've also spoken to couples who say, I actually need a break at the beginning, and I can't always be on, but I do need those 2 week off breaks. Maybe a full 2 weeks off is a little much, but maybe sometimes that those breaks can be helpful. The ping pong comes with its own challenges of switching modes so frequently. But as you're learning, sometimes taking those breaks can be a little bit helpful for some people. But when it's, okay, I'll let Rachel go. Go ahead.
So this question is one of the most popular questions I get, because I think it's such a common struggle for people. And I find that very often when I unpack it with people, and I'm not here in a halachic framework, right? I'm here from a clinical framework, but I find whenever I unpack this question with people, very often there's expectations in there that stem from what they were taught Taras Mishpacha was going to be like, or what it was going to feel like, right? I find other mitzvahs we don't teach with the same kind of, oh my gosh, you're going to keep kosher, and it's going to just feel, your food is going to taste amazing. And even when you go to Disney World and you can't buy the turkey drumsticks, you're just going to love your hot tuna sandwich, right? Like, we don't teach other mitzvahs necessarily with the same romance as we teach Taras Mishpacha. So I think the first thing is for people to feel permission to acknowledge to themselves that maybe they were taught it was going to be a certain way and that's not how it's playing out for them, but that doesn't mean that there's something defective about them. Okay. I find also that when we give this wholesale thing that like, oh my gosh, Taras Mishpacha, it's like so beautiful, it's always going to feel amazing. And we're telling that to people and we don't even know who they're married to and what it's like for them to communicate, right? Like, it's everyone's different. So I first just want to throw it out there that expectations sometimes set people up for this real disappointment because they were taught it was going to just feel so beautiful all the time. The other piece I want to mention is that self-care during the pandemic has presented a lot of challenges for people, and I think that part of the challenge of people being home a lot with each other is that you get really comfortable. So you get up in the morning and it's like, are you, like when the pandemic started, I made a rule with myself. I will always put on a fresh pair of pajamas in the morning, right? Because it's so easy in the pandemic to just kind of be like, right? And I think it's difficult when you have a married couple, they just got married and during dating, they were probably getting more dressed up for each other. And then they get married and then there's a pandemic. So they're sitting around They're not necessarily in the same kind of self-care routine. So I think one thing couples need to look at is just asking themselves as individuals, where's my own self-care at, right? Am I working out? Am I eating foods that agree with my body? Am I putting myself together? Because I think that that plays a really big role, because how we carry ourselves brings a certain energy to the relationship. Also, this idea that your spouse could be a one-stop shop for your happiness. So this is a common thing that I think comes out for people. I think there's that romantic notion that you're going to meet your partner and they're just going to like be your everything. And during a pandemic, unfortunately, people were stuck at home. So their spouse became their everything, but your spouse can't provide every single thing for you. So I think even for people to feel permission, a lot of this is about people feeling permission to have feelings. We are very judgmental about the feelings we have, and the judgmentalness we have about our feelings makes things worse. So in terms of how people can navigate this time, like you said, Shiffy, I think it's very, very specific. I think for me, I always hesitate about getting too detailed with advice, because what might work for one couple could actually be dysfunctional or destructive for another couple. But I think even just for couples to kind of together evaluate, like, how has it been going for us? What are areas where we think we could work on this together? Even just asking each other the question. I know people sometimes will measure a relationship of, oh, do you fight a lot? I don't love that question, because it doesn't necessarily communicate the intimacy and connection. My question is, when do you feel far away from each other? When do you feel close to each other? When do I feel far away from you? When do you feel far away from me? And being able to open those communications, those conversations, creates a lot more nuance and a lot more space to say, okay, invite me into your experience.
Wow. All right, thanks. There's just so much to unpack here. We have a lot of questions from the audience. So let's just choose just one, and I want to add on to it a little bit.
Every single one of these, by the way, every single one of these questions, we could have a 4-day conference about. I'm just saying.
And which we do.
And that's with being on time.
Right. The truth is, I would really highly suggest many of the questions that we're going to be discussing are actually going to be found in many of the other classes, and I would highly suggest checking out many of the classes. Just on a little bit of an announcement, many people were asking whether or not things will be recorded and accessible. The way the platform works is that when a class is over, the moment that it's over, you'll be able to see it, or not the moment, it takes a little bit of time to render, etc., but it will be accessible from the same spot as you access the class to join it live. Instead of a live button, it will say view recording. You'll be able to see the whole recording in the exact same way that you saw it live. And that's true about all the different classes in this. But just to end off with one more question, and I'll add to it a little bit. If someone is newly engaged, what are some important things to focus on during the time pre-wedding? And I'm going to add on to that in terms of not just for the couple to focus on, but also the community to focus on. How can the community be able to better support young couples throughout their marriages, and how could they better prepare young couples for marriage? So we're talking about what couples can do and a little bit of what the community can do, and we'll end with that. So just one, we'll start with Rachel, and we'll move to Shiffy.
Okay, this is a great question, because I think it's important for us to be able to differentiate between getting married versus being married. I think when people are engaged, a lot of their energy goes towards the process of getting married, of the wedding and those details, and there isn't as much focus on being married. And like I said, part of it is you learn on the job, but I do think we could do more as a community in empowering people to make different choices while they're engaged, so that we don't have to have this bad surprise party that happens for some people when they get married. So I think number one, we need to destigmatize going for premarital counseling. I find that some people, when they hear the idea of going to premarital counseling, it's like, oh my gosh, if they're going to therapy now, what does that mean? If they're already going now, they're not even married, right? Which I think we need to destigmatize that it could be very helpful for some couples to go for premarital counseling. And it's funny because people don't necessarily have that same hesitation about seeing like a coach or other types of professionals. So we still have some stigma around therapy right now. I think normalizing going for premarital counseling, I think people making sure that whoever they're going to learn their chassan and kala classes with, that it's somebody who they're asking the right questions. Just because somebody was like your teacher in high school and you were really close with her and you're like, oh my God, I want to learn with you. Like, people need to like ask questions up front with their teacher of like, tell me about your curriculum, right? Some people want a lot of halacha, not as much hashkafa, or they want it fluffy or they don't want it fluffy. But it's important for people to, I think, put some time into that in making sure that they're learning with someone who's going to give them healthy messages, because it's amazing. I find 20, 30 years later, people can remember very little about certain things, but they remember things that their chassan teacher or kala teacher told them. So that I think is very important. I think also when people are engaged, I think it's important for people to have a good balance between understanding this. I find we have two extremes. You have times where people are talking about things too much to too many people, posting too much on social media, sharing because they need to be authentic, right? Authentic doesn't mean you have to tell the whole world everything, right? But then we have this other extreme of people not talking to anyone about stuff that's going on, and finding this balance between like talking to the right people or finding the people. Like I always say, like your committee should not fill up a school bus, maybe a church van, but like your committee should not be so big, and maybe have a few trustees. But and also having relatives you could talk to is very, very helpful, but also understand that relatives, there's in terms of objectivity. So having that balance. So, I mean, I could keep talking, but Shiffy, I know you wanted to add on to this.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with you. The community's role can be analyzing something such as premarital counseling. I don't see, as you say, that being something that's like a given. But if we expect a couple to go through all sorts of changes going into marriage, then why not have it be something that's really like a rite of passage? And there are workshops out there that I don't really see people taking so much. You know, a workshop is maybe less of a barrier because you don't need to find a one-on-one session. It's out there for all English couples. You can find websites where you sign up, obviously, you know, so maybe.
Right, Shalom, I'm talking about Shalom workshop.
Right, exactly, something like that. It's probably a little bit easier to commit to than finding your therapist, especially today when it can be, I know you guys are all so busy these days, but maybe there could be more that communities can do to create more of those opportunities, which would be a really welcome thing. I know as a college teacher, I often hear all the things that college teachers should also be teaching, and there's so much that's already on our plates, and we can't always do everything as well as the professionals in the different fields. So I do try to touch on these topics, and maybe I should do it more, but having the collaboration with other experts could be a really welcome thing. And also just as community members, I think we need to look out for young married couples or newlywed couples a bit more. Sometimes we assume that they want to be left to themselves, and I'm sure that to an extent they want that time to themselves as well. But especially now when we're all with our smaller units and smaller pods, so much, to get an extra invitation from somebody who's not even of your age group, that could be a really welcome thing. Like you said, having your committee, I like that, Rachel. Maybe there are people who aren't going to be in your immediate circle, but just invite you over for a Shabbat meal and give you a warm welcome to a community. I think a lot of people are moving to new places, when they get married, and it's hard to meet people. And especially during the pandemic, it's even harder to meet people. And it's so important to have that network of support and having people who can introduce you to other people who you might get along with. So I would encourage all of us to go out there and notice who the people are who maybe wouldn't be as natural to normally be at your Shabbat table, but who might really appreciate that invitation. And you wouldn't necessarily be the one asking them, how often do you fight in your relationship, right? So those types of questions aren't going to come up in an
and don't ask them if they're pregnant. There's never an okay time to ask them if they're pregnant.
Right. There are a lot of questions you're not asking, but it's right. So of course you're not there as their therapist, but you're just there as maybe a family, maybe an individual who is just giving them a little bit of extra support, some interaction, social interactions, maybe networking, and maybe even you'll provide a role model for them, a model of a family Shabbat table, and that could be something really meaningful as well that we can do as community members.
Thank you so much. It was really a great conversation together, and really appreciate it. There's so much more to talk about. And whenever you leave with feeling like we didn't even cover as much as even half of what we wanted to speak about, I think that's a very positive thing. And I think the number one message and the takeaway that I've got from this conversation with you, and I thank you for joining me for this conversation, is that this has to be intentional. We have to be focusing on this. We have to, as couples, we have to be focusing on it. As a community, we have to focus on it. And we need a lot more support, a lot more resources out there, information out there, education out there. And as a community, we have to make this a priority. Mizrat Hashem, moving forward, that's going to be the trajectory that we're going to be going. So thank you all for coming. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Many, many more classes to come. Enjoy also, you can be looking around on the platform. There's lots of other classes that you can be looking at. So enjoy. And if you have any questions or need support, please reach out to our support team. See you later.
Thank you so much.